So we are Group 11. We are going to present about the Singapore's history. So, okay, I'm going to start telling you how everything changed through the history of Singapore. So before all the invasion, Singapore was only habitated by 1,000 people. So the people from South India, they were colonized by the British, and they arrived to Singapore, and they formed this kind of trading port, and people from Malaysia, from India and China started to immigrate to Singapore, and afterwards they started a browse because Portuguese and Dutch colonies wanted these territories as well. But basically the British won this kind of land, and at the end, in 1826, they had a treaty. It was founded by Thomas Stanford Raffles, and only in question of 20 years, Singapore passed from a population of 1,000 people to 80,000 people. In the 1870s, the island became global center of rubber exports. And Singapore, after this bloom, it started to have different changes. When the First World War happened, there was a lot of prostitution, a lot of drugs, and a lot of social issues that they started to change with the passage of the time. So after the World War II, Singapore started to improve this weak economy that they have.
Okay, thank you so much, Luis, for your speech. It was a good speech. So we're gonna continue with Singapore history after 8 December of 1941. And what happens in Singapore is that it was a long time ago, it was known as Sea Town, and then it became Singapura. Singa means lion and Pura means city, and that's why we call the city of lion. And then the Singapore was considered like from Malay Peninsula, so they predominate like Malay. And then, did you know that the first architect, like, it was George Coleman? He arrived in 1822, and he built like the Palladian-style houses. So that's why Singapore has a lot of those. Then what happened is Singapore is very diverse, and ethical residential areas were divided in certain areas. So, like, for example, people from different backgrounds had different positions. So ethnic Indians resided at Shulia Kampong, north of Chinatown. Kampong clan was consisted of Muslims, ethnic Malays, and Arabs who had migrated to Singapore. And then we have the Asians, Eurasians, and Europeans as well. Then Singapore became a British crown colony after the Japanese surrender, because Japanese came and surrendered Singapore, and they built the army in 1942. And as well in 1942, it was created, like, they maintained some like cultures and traditions, for example, the Chinese New Year. And yes, in April 1946, Singapore became a British crown colony, like, totally. In 1942 started, and then 1946 finished.
Group 12.
Thank you.
Hi guys, today we'll be talking about the racial and religious tensions in Singapore, and in our presentation we'll be talking mainly about an organization called One People SG, which is an organization aiming to reduce the general racial tension in the country. To give a slight overview of our issue, I'm just going to start talking about a few statistics to get your head around how big of a problem this actually is. According to a survey done by One People SG, approximately 50% of Singaporeans do not have a close friend who is a different race to them, and only 23.3% of Chinese Singaporeans said that they had one Malay friend. One People SG, again, is a national body focused on advocating for these racial and religious harmonies in Singapore. In workplace situations, around 25% of the respondents of the survey claim that racial discrimination still occurs, and 20% think that Malay and Indians have to work harder in order to achieve a decent life in the country, despite the fact that 70% of the respondents say that race should not be a factor considered while choosing a job or for getting hired.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about why religious tensions are a problem right now in Singapore. A politician called Sayudin Nordin claimed that it was natural for people to gravitate towards others in the same race while forging new relationships. External threats such as jihadist terrorism can threaten religious and radical harmony in Singapore. Considering that around 75% of the population in Singapore is Chinese, it is usually Chinese people who become friends with other Chinese people. In terms of issues arising from this, there are tensions right now between the old Singaporeans and the new Indian/Chinese immigrants due to both language and cultural barriers arising from a lack of awareness about minority cultures. Dealing with potential threats of terrorism requires particular care, as it is important not to radicalize certain groups against others. Also, according to the current Prime Minister, Singapore's original pioneers strongly believe in the idea of a multicultural society based on equality, and so present leaders have a mission to uphold. Radical and religious matters are in some ways more complicated now than 50 years ago, as evident from the occasional prickly issues and incidents with a radical tinge, said Mr. Lee.
Okay, so overall, limited racial and religious tensions exist in Singapore, with 70% of people saying that they have not experienced racial tensions in Singapore, and that the diversity of races in the country is a good thing. At the same time, 10% of Malays and Indians still feel like they're treated badly when using public services, so efforts should still be made to close the gap between races. One such effort has been made by the OPSG organization, which aims to provide opportunities to the majority of the population, that is the Chinese people, to interact with the minority. The organization has also been initiating programs where people from different races can interact with each other, but after all, it is also the duty of the people to make sure that they diversify their friendship groups in terms of races. Singapore has hitherto been able to deal with some religious conflicts by having responsible religious leaders who set a good example for citizens to follow. The Prime Minister said that solving these issues can be challenging, as it is important to remain sensitive to various racial and religious groups. So despite these measures in place, Mr. Lee noted that while most Singaporeans subscribe to racial and religious harmony, less than half had at least one close friend of another race. So the youth constantly has to be reminded that while Singapore enjoys relative racial and religious coexistence, the existing harmony is precious, unusual, and rare.
Okay, so our group, we talked about human rights in Singapore. So I'm going to start with sexual orientation and gender identity. So the first thing is Singapore law dating from 1938 bans sexual relationship between two men. Sections 3778 state that any male person who in public or private take part in any sexual acts with another man will be punished with imprisonment for a term which may extend to 2 years. It's important to notice that the law does not ban woman to woman sexual relationship. In 2014, 2 years ago, a law that was supposed to ban employment discrimination against LGBT individuals failed. The LGBT community is not barred for military service, but LGBT military people are classified by sexual orientation and evaluated on a scale of effeminacy.
So I'll be focusing more on the freedom of expression and the criminal justice system. So we all know that the freedom of expression in Singapore is pretty poor, the way we say it in school usually. So one example would be the Singapore's Media Development Authority, which is also known as the MDA. So they banned a film called To Singapore With Love. So basically the film featured interviews with activists who fled Singapore rather than face political persecution and possible detention under the country's abusive Internal Security Act. So the film director Tan Pin Pin filed an appeal against this ban, stating that the people should be able to air different views about her past, even the views that the government.
I'll talk about the wealth inequality as well. So we have the median wealth is half the value of the median wealth in Singapore. So this shows the inequality between the rich and the poor. So it affects the social mobility in Singapore. This means that if you're born into a low-income family, you have lower chances of moving up the economic ladder and uplifting yourself from that poverty. So Chinese workers earn monthly wages of around $1,000 to $1,500 on average, while those Bangladeshi have minimum wage laws, say $1.80 an hour. So this shows the inequality in terms of wealth, depending on where you're coming from, if you're Chinese, if you're Bangladeshi or Indian.
When we talk about wealth inequality, it's relevant to talk about the Gini index, and the Gini measures how income is distributed in a society, and the closer the Gini value is to 1, the more unequal the distribution of income is. Singapore's own official data shows that its Gini coefficient is 0.412, and this is after taxes and transfers. To compare this to some of the other countries in the world, the UK and the Australia has a Gini coefficient on around 0.35, and Germany has a Gini coefficient on 0.29. The Singaporean government has made efforts to combat this inequality by increasing taxes at the top and increasing wages at the bottom of the wealth ladder. There are workfare income supplements available for low-income earners in Singapore, but when we talk about income inequality, it's also important to take into account the difference between wealth and income, as wealth can be held in assets such as housing or investments, and the wealth gap in Singapore is much larger than the income gap. So the wealth gap is harder to distribute, as household wealth can be passed along the family line, and yeah, thank you.
I think it depends which level of income you're getting, I guess, or where you're working, or where you are, which school you're in. Because there are a lot of problems in Singapore, like we just said. There's a gender discrimination, there's the wealth inequalities, and there's this the immigration problem. So I guess it depends, like where you are, where you're working, where you're studying, and that we can't really account for like what's the most biggest problem Singaporeans are facing, because everyone's facing different problems.
I know you're mentioning the MTA, the development process. What do you think of the plan to ban the MTA? The government has put forth a plan to ban the MTA and young actors. What do you think of that plan?
Can you explain what the plan?
So basically, they're going to merge the MTA with the project department and creating infrastructure. So basically, it's just going to have the organization based on ensuring that it's like one house to work, that kind of stuff. And it's going to be less emphasis on censorship afterwards.
Hey guys, sorry, just want to make a point. Think back to your voice level and use your level 4 or level 5, okay, in this audience size. And let's try and do it without the use of the microphone, okay?
So I think that if you merge MDA with the infrastructure authority, I don't know what you call it, it will remove emphasis on the censorship, which is good to an extent, but looking at some places like France or something, some people might start abusing that power because we haven't been given such freedom to voice our opinion. they might abuse such power and maybe cause some problems, like they did in France, maybe. Just an example.
Do you think there would be any negative outcomes from creating a poverty line or raising the minimum wage or creating a minimum wage?
It could make it less attractive for foreign workers to move to or immigrate to Singapore, as they could have, or as it may be harder for them to get work here.
Okay, so the question was, would there be negative aspects to having a poverty line or a minimum wage? I think that with the implementation of a minimum wage, it would help equal out the wealth inequality to some extent, because people who are earning the very little as they do right now would have the opportunity to earn more.
Echoing her, it would make Singapore have a bad face. You know Singapore is the richest country, then you finally realize that 15% of the Singapore population lives below the poverty line. So it wouldn't be a more attractive country to people who want to live here.
Does the government recognize publicly about the situation of couple of immigrants that come here, to work, and they live as laborers, as the helpers, come from Indonesia or come from Philippines? And does the government recognize it? How does it allow them to come here and live in this situation?
You see, one of the issues is that the government does not recognize foreign workers as part of the Singaporean population. So a lot of the studies and data that they have available to the public does not include foreign workers. So, the point was that if they allow, why do they allow them to come and give them that reputation? I guess it's the general consensus of the sort of reputation that they somehow have gathered over the years amongst the population, possibly caused by the fact that the government somewhat segregates them from the general population. So it creates this boundary between Singaporeans and foreign workers.
Noel, guys, it's very interesting, but in the interest of time, we're going to cut questions for this particular one and ask the next team to go up. Thank you very much, Singapore team. Also, as the next team is getting ready to go up to take your
historical background leading up to conflict in Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste was colonized by the Portuguese in 1520, which later led to a split in 1749 between the Portuguese and the Dutch. In 1975, East Timor was declared independent, followed by an invasion by Indonesia, using the justification as its fight against communism as a pretext. The Indonesian rule that followed was repression and famine, in which 200,000 people are thought to have died. In 1991, the Santa Cruz Cemetery massacre, in which troops fired on mourners at a funeral in Dili, a Fredolin supporter, killing more than 100 people. Later on, in 1999, in January, Indonesia says it will consider independence for East Timor if the people reject autonomy. Later, again in May, Portugal signed an agreement to allow the East Timorese to vote on their future deal endorsed by the UN. And then later, again in 1999 in September, the result of the referendum showed that 78% of voters favored independence, and yet violence erupts as an anti-independence militia, helped by the Indonesian military, resumes campaign of terror. In 2001, there was an election where 88 members Constituent Assembly Federal Party wins, taking 55 seats. And in 2002, there was an independence where VIP guests, including the former Bill Clinton and Indonesian president, were joined to celebrate in Dili.
Okay. So by now you're probably all wondering what does that all have whether or not this has anything to do with the conflicts. The thing is, with the conflicts in East Timor, it's very important that we look to the context of history when we're trying to resolve the matter. One of the major problems of public perception of foreign support these days is the common belief and some evidence supporting the fact that the government of the United States, under Gerald Ford and with the support of Henry Kissinger, gave Indonesia the green light for the invasion in 1975. As a result of this perception amongst the Timorese public, foreign aid is commonly looked upon with suspicion. Therefore, there are some issues even with the UN forces that have been helping over the past few decades. Another major problem in relation to Indonesia is the perception that, that Indonesia has essentially inherited the dispute between the Dutch and the Portuguese over the island of Timor, because Timor was essentially divided between East Timor and West Timor becoming Dutch and subsequently Indonesian, and East Timor becoming a Portuguese colony and subsequently independent. When considering solutions for this, we have to look very deeply at the common perceptions amongst the Timorese public, and as well as the Indonesian public when we're trying to solve the problem. Therefore, it's very important that we keep all this in mind when we're trying to assist or discuss the matters going on in East Timor today.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about the gang violence and martial arts in Timor-Leste. So martial arts are famous for the ideals of discipline and self-restraint, but many do not respect these ideals, like members of gangs who have been taught this martial arts in East Timor and took their limited knowledge of this onto the street. Street violence has plagued East Timor and its capital since independence in 2002. Many of these armed groups and gangs, including martial arts groups, have evolved from clandestine resistance groups from the Indonesian colonial period. Recently, 12 deaths and 200 were injured in an attack by these gangs in 1 month. And from these antics have promoted the government to ban a local form of martial art, pencat salat. It's a martial art that originated in Indonesia and was glorified by East Timorese who fought Jakarta's occupation of the former Portuguese colony with this form of martial arts. It is hoped that this banning and the consequences of practicing this martial art will decrease the violence. Due to the large in East Timor, martial arts are used mainly for 4 reasons: for property disputes, gang turf competitions, revenge, and kind of just showing the strength of the men of East Timor. But the problem is many of these gangs have diversified and multiplied, which indicates that there's a large social tension, and this has grown due to the weakening of the states and institutions of the government.
Hi, we'll be talking about domestic violence in Timor. So in Timor-Leste, gender inequality is prominent and brutal. 38% of women aged 15 to 49 have experienced violence at some point in their life, and many didn't report the issue due to fear, lack of access to support and police stations, and the belief that problems should be kept within the family. In Timor, women generally have a low education level and don't feel empowered to talk about these issues. Due to these factors, 3 out of 4 cases go unreported, and in 2010, the government promulgated laws against domestic violence. However, the trial process is still very inefficient, and thus Timor hasn't progressed significantly.
Yeah, in 2010, when the law against domestic violence was passed, the government also looked to, trying to reduce domestic violence in Timor-Leste, and one of the many things that they've decided to do is, to change beliefs and people's attitude and behavior towards this, towards the violence taking place against women, and also to make assistance more accessible. One of the many reasons why the domestic violence in Timor-Leste is very high is because they have no access to getting close to police station, and so the problems are actually being solved in the houses, and they're using traditional methods such as men beating up their wives. Also, we have working against impunity, and that's for those many cases that don't make it to court, they're trying to make it easy for them to make it to court this time around by bringing in stakeholders and investors to help link them with going to court.
So now I'm going to be talking about the economic context and development issues that are present in Timor-Leste. So in 2002, Timor-Leste became independent. However, in this struggle, 70% of all the buildings and schools were destroyed and 75% of the population was displaced. This devastation was really significant and we can still see the effects of it today. So in the past 13 years of its independence, there have been some developments which include nearly halving the infant mortality rate and the child mortality rate, increasing citizen participation in society, and strengthening state institutions such as the Ministry of Defense. 60% of the population is currently under 25, and as such, the government is trying to attempt to develop the nation by creating more job opportunities for the youth. And then they actually have a lot of natural resources, including coffee, marble, oil, and sandalwood, and their economy has been growing steadily, and in 2011 to 2012 it grew by 10%. Timor-Leste does get a significant part of its economy from offshore oil and gas reserves, but little of it has gone towards development in villages. The majority of people interact with a mostly agrarian economy, which means that the normal person who would live in Timor-Leste wouldn't have much access to foreign goods, and half of the population lives in extreme poverty.
East Timor has the lowest per capita income in the world, which is $400 per annum, according to the CIA World Factbook. By 2012, they were able to hold peaceful democratic elections for president and parliament. Timor-Leste economically benefits from oil, as Asha said earlier. However, poverty still remains, especially in the rural areas of the country. The young population is gradually starting to become more educated, so this means that the youth can help sustain growth and prepare a more sustainable future. Therefore, Timor-Leste currently needs to diversify its economy source because it would elevate the quality of health and education, meaning these efforts would increase the economy of Timor-Leste even more. And lastly, some quick facts about the economy of Timor-Leste. The population is 1.2 million, the GDP is 6.1 billion, and at a growth of 6.6% per year. The unemployment rate is actually pretty low at 4.7%, and the inflation rate is 2.5%.
It's important to note that although these numbers seem large, the majority of the resources won't be going to the average person, and that despite some economic advances, the majority of the population just lives in a simple agrarian lifestyle.
Okay, I'm gonna talk about the work towards
the elders who were educated entirely under the Indonesian system.
Alright, so youth identity. Timor, after its independence in 2002, has to hold new political orders emerging from the colonial past, have not only to redefine societies that acknowledge the rich variety of acknowledged linguistic groups within their borders. They also have to be able to deal with legacies and interests of powerful global forces. As the IfP facilitators are going to visit the young minds of Timor-Leste, it is important to understand the youth of Timor within all these multilingual identity of the nation itself, as the energetic and dynamic transition of young people to adult life is a valuable resource for the development of empowerment of the country. So I'm the National Youth Policy of Timor. The National Youth Policy of Timor-Leste is the first document to define the guidelines for promoting holistic welfare of young people. The state undertakes to support the new generation to face a better future and to celebrate the success of the struggle for liberation and the meaning of independence for Timor. The integrated vision assumes that the justice between the present and future generations is recognized as a fundamental base for sustainable development. The National Youth Policy of Timor should be seen as a means to allow the growing participation of young people in the fight against poverty and to improve socioeconomic welfare of Timor society in general. Thank you. Any questions?
the issue of gender inequality is definitely one that needs to be tackled through a plethora of different means. The government in East Timor has, to its credit, taken some steps by introducing laws and other such things. However, the biggest problem currently impeding these efforts is the lack of access to quality education, especially for women, because they aren't necessarily going to be aware of any laws or movements aimed at, bettering the situation unless they have access to means through which they can get information about it.
Yeah, but I was going to say, it's quite difficult to address the human rights issues that are happening in such a slowly developing economy where the majority of people don't have access to basic
In 2008, the president of Timor-Leste invited the United Nations to work with them and things like that. So I feel like it depends on the people of Timor-Leste themselves and their mindset towards gender equality, because the government is trying to do some things to help, and so it depends on if they want to give up that culture that they seem to have.
You guys did mention there's a slight trust issue between people in Timor-Leste and foreigners. What kind of possible solution do you guys have in mind to solve that issue?
Well, these issues are definitely, there's not much difference in many ways from the same issue in different countries. This issue is, especially in East Timor, the problem is that foreign interference is not necessarily looked on as something positive considering their history from being colonized to being essentially recolonized by another country after independence. So I suppose the only way for the national community to work with the community of East Timor is to build relations centered on trust. So activities like conferences that IfP intends to hold should center not only around resolving their issues domestically, but around building connections between them and people from other countries. So that's something that I believe should be focused on.
One more question.
You guys mentioned that there's a lack of distribution of resources. So what has the government done to tackle that?
Well, the government, as we mentioned, has a significant amount of money coming to the country from offshore oil resources, but it appears that that money is going towards fixing infrastructure. So at the moment, it's difficult to assess any programs that the government may be trying to install. It seems like their priorities may not be as other countries that
Yeah, and one issue with natural resources, especially with the oil industry, is that the companies making the money are not necessarily from East Timor. So GDP revenue is earned, but it's not actually going into the pockets of anybody in East Timor, except for a small portion that goes in taxes to governments. And the problem is the handful of employees who happen to be from East Timor, companies with oil rigs and stuff like that, aren't necessarily going to be well paid enough. So I think the solution essentially centers around the economic independence of the country, around establishing their own industry and not being reliant on foreign companies to exploit their resources.
Another long-term solution on creating economic stability is the government's effort to enhance the educational system, where further in the future the locals will be able to have positions at the higher paying companies, and therefore that will be a start in distributing
Let's get the last team ready. Yes.
I believe I use that expression in my class.
Okay, and as soon as you are ready, you may begin.
ethnic groups have fled to Thailand because of the armed conflicts or Honduras human rights abuse and persecution by the Burmese military. Thousands of villages, especially Karen and Karenni estates, were burned to ground, including houses, villages, buildings, school belongings, and sometimes even domestic animals.
The emergence of the economic migrant category in the context of Burmese migration stems from the early 1990s, when, as a result of significant economic changes in Thailand and the country's improved relationship with Burma, in particular the Thai policy of constructive engagement with Burma, instigated at the end of the Cold War to turn battlefields into marketplaces, initiated a shift towards cross-border trade, increased Thai economic investment in resource extraction projects in Burma, and a source of labor for Thailand's rise towards being a regional manufacturing power. As a result, the border region in Thailand has become an attractive place to open new or relocate existing garment factories, and as such, migration to the region increased.
Now we will talk about the background of the Mela. It's a campus, the largest campus of refugees in Thailand, the Burmese refugees. So what happened is that after the independence of the country, the minority groups as Karen and other ones, they start to be persecuted in the country, in Myanmar. So as a way to escape, they start to cross the border and start to live in this region that we don't have the map here, but in the border of Thailand and Myanmar. So, and another part went to Bangladesh. But this campus is the biggest one, and after a huge number in 1984, what happened was that the government started to call them and started to recognize them as refugees, because almost 1,100 people got there and started to leave. And then now, for example, we have more than 40,000 people living as refugees. And they face many issues there that she'll explain later. But basically, these people are there because they are persecuted in their country because of their ethnic groups. They are minority in the country, in Myanmar.
So some of the problems faced by the refugees, Thailand's refugee policies leaves these refugees vulnerable to abusive treatment, as the laws put in place are inadequate, and the lack of the legal framework regarding the refugees and asylum seekers makes the situation rather unpredictable and uncertain. Additionally, the government only screens and registers a small fraction of all the refugees coming in, and as they are not registered, they are then considered illegal. Refugees therefore have two options. They can stay in the refugee camp and be protected from arrest or deportation. However, there they lack freedom. Alternatively, they can leave the camps, but without any legal status, they risk being arrested and deported, and are therefore vulnerable to exploitation. So just to list a few of the possible solutions. So first of all, it would be to enforce a much clearer legal framework regarding the refugees and asylum seekers, and also prosecute those officials that abuse the refugees outside of the camps. They could also screen more and more refugees and register them to ensure that these refugees are considered to be legally living in the country. And also they should make it, they could make it simpler to obtain work permits for refugees.
So earlier in 2015, the government had seized land which encompassed homes, farms, and the land in which people had earned their living through. Refugees in Mae Sot were internally displaced, and as a result, this is as a result of the ongoing conflict that has stemmed from the internal conflict in 1948. So, although there are talks that are going on to create a special economic zone mainly for these migrants, refugees. There are already an estimated of 200 factories operating in this area, many of which are both illegal and legal. And the official Thai census estimates 100,000 migrant workers living in Mae Sot, but in reality there are most of them which are undocumented.
Okay, I add more information. A massive 1,500 kilometer highway that links Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos has turned Mae Sot to be an economic zone, and Mae Sot has around 500,000 Burmese migrant workers. Most of the town service industry are supported by Burmese migrants that work in the sweet shop and factories throughout the region. However, most migrant workers are struggling to live even though the town is getting richer because the demand for jobs is high and most migrants get only low-wage jobs, around 65 to 125 baht per day. And this town also suffers from a black market in illegal smuggling, people trafficking, and narcotics.
Okay, so now we move on to looking at the political and economic context of Thailand. So first, to begin, we look at the political context. So formally, the country had been a democratic one, with a prime minister as the head of the government. However, they were also hereditary monarchs, with the king as the head of state. The king is highly respected and loved within the country. The king, however, does not have much constitutional power and is instead more of a symbol of national identity and pride, which must be considered. The country was in fact formerly a democratic one, but due to the military coup in 2014, the constitution within the country has in fact been revoked. The country is now under constant surveillance and rule of the National Council for Peace and Order. Unfortunately, this was not the first coup against the government. Since 1932, the government has undergone 19 military coups, with 2014 being the last straw.
So the constant political instability within the country has had drastic results on the country's economy. Thailand has unfortunately been unable to achieve many of its goals and regarding to economic growth. And however, the economy grew from 1982 until its collapse during the 1997 to 1998 Asian financial crisis. So the political situation continues to burden the country's economy as the government attempts to restrict foreign investment in many of the sectors of the economy in order to attempt to become less dependent on other countries and to keep a firmer hold on the economy of within the country. So there is also a social distribution as a problem, with nearly 40% of the Thai population being engaged in agriculture. Also, another problem that Thailand faces is that they are by no means the only country within the region to be in this stage of development. Meaning that the competition within the region means that there's not a lot of emphasis on Thailand in helping it, and therefore causes leading to the progress being slower and less financial backup. Having said that, we need to commemorate that Thailand has moved from a low-income country to an upper-income country in less than a generation, which has been rarely seen throughout history. And it is expected that if the Thai economy, that in order for the Thai economy to settle, the political situation has to be solved. But this is encouraging for a country who has recently undergone a military coup and is accepting and only receiving limited foreign aid.
Okay, so now I'll be talking about the political and economic issues in Thailand. So Thailand is a very politically involved country and embraces the idea of international relation with any country. Thailand uses its presence within the UN and the CETO to attempt to better handle the problems faced within the country, but also to give useful advice to countries less developed than itself. It uses its membership within these organizations to build stronger bonds between countries. The situation of refugees from Myanmar in Thailand has become one of the world's most protracted refugee crises, and there is a need to find durable and long-term solutions. Due to Thailand's commitment to international relations, and also thanks to its generosity, the Thai government has hosted migrants and refugees in temporary shelters along its borders.
fear of loss of your own culture?
It's my point of view, but basically, if you see are different ethnical groups, and as in all the nations happens, when they declare independence, these groups, they don't feel represented in the country. So as they don't feel represented for the government, they start to ask for independence. And as they couldn't do it, what happened is that the majority group start to persecute them, and they need to escape. Now it's quite changing. Of course, it keeps happening, and now it's starting another problem that are the Buddhists against the Muslims. That's minority in the country. But as we had like the presidential things, and there is a woman that I really forgot her name, which is very, very important, but I forgot her name, that she's like giving them the hope again and everything about it. But yes, it's only about they don't feel represented. A couple of groups they didn't feel, and they keep on feeling because they are persecuted, because they are minority in the country. And it happens, like it happened in India in the independence, it happened in other countries like in Asia, in around the world, that they are really different. Their culture, their language, their everything. And yeah, and now there is a conflict between Buddhists and Muslims, and yeah.
From what you said, apparently the person staying in refugee camps are actually up to the fate of the government to give them citizenship. So, is their future hopeful, or do they have to wait until organizations like you step in?
Please, can you repeat louder?
Thanks. From what you said, the persons living in the refugee camps, their fate is actually up to the government to make them citizens. Do they have a hopeful future, and do they have to wait until an organization such as the UN actually step in to help?
Is anyone? Yeah, you want? Yeah, I want as well, but.
Right now, I would say that the economic situation within Thailand is a little bit, it's quite stressed, it's quite tight, and so it's quite hard for the government at present moment to be able to help these people without taking away from its own. And so at present moment, yes, it does appear as though these people are simply waiting, but as soon as they get the opportunity, the Thailand government does intend to help them and make them citizens.
And basically, we cannot as well say that these people, they are there wondering to have the rights in Thailand. No. First of all, they are refugees, and they wander to come back to their home. But the problem is that, okay, Thailand cannot support now because of economic issues and because of the huge number of people, because we are not talking only about one refugee camp. We are focusing one, but there are more than 10 different ones in the zone. So, yeah, but the main important thing is to overcome the issues that Myanmar is facing. And then the people that usually they want to come back, because I was watching a couple of videos, and they want to come back home, but they don't feel safe. So it's the main problem is how will they come back to their home? How will we overcome the problem that Myanmar is facing?
Has the government previously implemented any policies to try and integrate the migrants culturally and not just economically?
Who wants to?
As far as we know, they haven't tried anything. In fact, they reduced the number of people that they were registering, the number of refugees that they were registering. So it seems more like they're not making it any easier for refugees to be integrated into the Thai population.
I believe that, yes. In fact, I believe all aspects of government and everything like that would be helped if when the political situation does get better. Because these military coups, they affect absolutely every part of the government and everything that they're able to handle. It's actually a miracle that they're able to achieve as much as they do at present moment. And so I definitely think that the situation for the refugees will get better once there is political stability within the country.
Last question.
Seeing as you've been discussing citizenship to a large extent, so the debates primarily center around granting the refugees citizenship or granting them temporary asylum until the issues are resolved in Burma?
Basically, this temporarily, it's like since 1984, so it's like, it's not that temporary. Like there are people living there since they were born and now they are 40 and 30 things, 40 years old. Of course, the government, as you said, Thailand should support them, but basically we need to think as well as the government. And basically, we have to do something to overcome the issue in Myanmar. That's one point, to make them not try to show how to live in different societies, because maybe it's not only cultural issue, it's a territory issue as well. It's like people who want to declare independence, people who, you know, so it's the point. The point is try to put ourselves in their place and try to see the real issue, because it's not that simple as only give asylum or something like that. It's much more.
On top of Patrick's point, we also have to keep in mind that the present government is the National Council for Peace and Order, and unfortunately what they're trying to do at present moment, it seems that they're trying to keep a strain on the country, and so they actually don't want people to be registered as citizens, and so I think at the present moment they would be more focused on making them seek asylum rather than citizenship.
And first of all, we have to know as well if they want to do it, because they are from Myanmar. They are like, refugees, they don't want to stay in the place usually. Usually they want to come back home. But how will they come back home if they will not be safe? It's the point. It's not only to give citizenship, because maybe we don't know if they want. So.
Thank you very much. I would like to see some of these fishes that have been crossed.